I want to talk about in this lecture is discussions, but I want to focus on student-led discussions. Um, Discussions which are led by teachers, and these may be spontaneous discussions, can be extremely effective. But here I want to take a more student-centered approach. And what I'm going to do is work through various points that you need to consider when constructing this kind of student-centered, student-led approach to discussions. Okay, so the first thing to think of is integration. So try to link the discussion with the theme or topic of the current unit you're teaching, rather than just plucking the discussion out of thin air. You should already have been able to monitor the level of interest in the topic, and students probably will already have some relevant vocabulary if you're following on from some previous reading or writing or listening activity. So in fact, discussions that follow on a reading or listening activity are often extremely effective because you've already provided a level of content and you've already provided a level of vocabulary which is going to allow students to discuss their particular ideas because they've had time to think about it and they've got the vocabulary to use to discuss this particular topic. Next, hot topics. Probably a good idea to avoid them. Hot topics like, say, abortion, which are extremely divisive, tend to create more heat than light, and so they're not perhaps the best way to promote a lot of speaking practice and activity. That doesn't mean we have to make our topics bland. But we need to be sensitive to what topics are going to be divisive and therefore not good tools for promoting language practice. 3 stages. Think about structuring your discussion so that it moves through various stages. So start off with the individual and allow the individual time to think and to organize their particular ideas. Move on to pair and group work, which provides a safer environment for a lot of shyer students to be able to talk. And then finally move on to a plenary activity where you draw the whole class together. This particular approach of staging a discussion has certain advantages. So for example, it allows students to prepare for the discussion. It gives them planning time. And it also helps give the discussion a focus because in these individual phases and pair group work phases, you can begin to allow students to, they can begin to focus on particular issues. And as I said before, these particular pair work, group work allows shyer students perhaps to speak, whereas they may not want to speak in a more plenary situation. And also, while the teacher is going around the particular pairs, listening in, it allows the teacher to monitor for things like vocabulary, lexis, so that you can feed that in if you feel as though students need particular words and phrases. 4, grouping. This is true of most activities, but perhaps even more important with discussions. So take into consideration when you're putting the groups together, those students who are talkative and those who are shy, maybe putting those together or maybe separating them. Think about other variables like shared L1. Think also of gender, think also of personality. So when you're creating these groups, you might want to think of these particular dynamics. It's often a good idea to assign a task because that gives a particular focus to the discussion. So for example, you can ask them to do matching exercises or ranking exercises. Like a ranking exercise would be what are the 3 most important things you would take if you if you were stranded on a desert island. What are the 3 most important qualities you would look for in are a member of the opposite sex, for example. Assign jobs. So in a discussion, there are particular jobs that students can play. For example, jobs can be a content note taker. That is somebody who's the secretary and makes notes on all the different particular contributions and issues that are talked about. You can also have a language note taker. That is somebody who listens to particular interesting uses or particular problems in the use of language, and they can also report as well. Um, you also need a timekeeper, and a timekeeper can be important because it can, our timekeeper can restrict people to certain contributions and make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. And then you also probably will need something like a facilitator, and the facilitator is the person who says, "Okay, let's hear from you. Okay, good. Next, we haven't heard from you, Jimmy. What about you, Mary?" So that's the facilitator role. So it's good to think of these particular roles and assigning them and rotating them, of course, in the particular group discussion. Um, Yeah, just as a note, a point there, a shy student could be the note taker so that they'll have a chance to talk in the plenary session, so because they can report back on their particular notes. Um, Assign roles. Some discussions may allow students to assume different roles. This may encourage students to escape inhibitions and may invigorate the discussion. So rather than being themselves, they could take on the role of a scientist or a lawyer or whatever particular role, which would allow them to escape from their actual selves, and so they wouldn't be less concerned about the kinds of errors maybe they're making. So role play can be, for many students, a form of escape and facilitate discussion. 8. See if you can feed in some useful language, the language of discussion. And this is always an opportunity and a very important part of having discussions. The particular functional use of the language is that of argument. So think about what kind of functions they will need to perform while they're discussing. For example, they'll need to make points. I believe that. I argue that. I maintain that. They'll be agreeing and disagreeing. I agree with that. That's right. And then of course it's a little more difficult to disagree, and you're probably going to use some kind of hedging. I understand what you're saying, but, and there's the disagreement. Asking for clarification. I didn't quite understand that. I wonder if you could mind rephrasing that. And then if you're the facilitator, you might want to do things like summarizing. So let's go over what we have talked about so far and see if we can find areas we can agree upon. Okay, so that's vital with a discussion, a structured discussion. There needs to be some feeding in of the kind of language that's used in discussion. 9, autonomy. The whole point of a student-centered discussion um, is to make it as autonomous as possible, and as a teacher to kind of stand out from it and not to contribute, which allows the space for students to fill that space, and therefore they have more practice because they have more autonomy. For example, so at the plenary stage, you can assign one of the students to be, or a group of students to be the moderators. And so they can moderate the discussion rather than the teacher. And one of the problems with having teachers as moderators is that everything seems to go through the teacher rather than go from student to student. It goes student, teacher, teacher, student, because the teacher is seen as the authority and the evaluator of the particular ideas and opinions being expressed. So that's one of the great things about getting the teacher out of the way and let students communicate directly with each other. 10. Closure. It's great to give a discussion a sense of closure. Usually discussions don't have a sense of closure, but it's nice to be able to do this. So you can require students to reach a conclusion in terms, say, of a recommendation or shared opinion. So a discussion could end in a vote, a summing up of the general mood, or a survey of those who change their opinions in the course of the discussion. The simplest is having a vote, of course, which gives a sense of end to the particular discussion. Okay, 11. We're going to exploit the discussion. We're going to extend it. We're going to see what we can do with all these ideas and opinions that have been generated, and to move perhaps into a different skill area. So discussions can be extended by staged input of information. For example, well, yeah. What this refers to is that we can provide a certain set of information which drives the discussion, and then at a later stage introduce further information which could be in the form of a short reading, for example, or a short listening. So for example, in the desert island task, which I'll talk about in the next lecture, and it's the classic one of, what things would you want to have on a desert island. At a particular stage into this discussion, further information could be given about the particular climate of the desert island, thus forcing students to abandon earlier considerations. Maybe it's not the classic island in the South Pacific, but maybe it's an island up in the Arctic Circle. Okay. Next, you'll be monitoring, and the thing about discussions is that they're great sources of spontaneous language practice that the teacher can be making notes on and thinking about using that as a way of planning future lessons. You'll be focusing on certain errors or certain patterns of avoidance of certain structures, and that could be a source for you to say, okay, I'm going to focus on a lesson on this at a future date. And 13, follow-up. All right. This is the exploitation part. We're not just going to stop the discussion. We're going to see if we can use all those ideas, opinions, all that language use, and use it in a different skill area. You're going to try to assign a reading, a writing, or listening activity which will exploit the discussion. Discussions are great ways, of course, of providing basic ideas from which to do some writing, because you've got all the ideas, you've got all the arguments, and so now you can begin to assemble them together in the form of an essay, for example, or a letter, or to a newspaper, or whatever. Okay, so give that a go. It's not your traditional discussion. It's a student-centered discussion, which needs a lot of work in structuring and going through these stages. In the next lecture, I'm going to give you an example of this and how this works, and, well, several examples.